Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Saturday everybody, and a very happy Easter weekend to those of you who celebrate it. Yesterday's video was a rather long one, so for today, for the weekend, let's try and keep it short. And let's begin with the Chinese economy. In a special editorial this week, leading Chinese financial media outlet Caixin has warned its domestic audience that, despite mainstream expectations of moderate growth this year, driven by a temporary rebound in pent-up demand, China may, quote, struggle to maintain its growth momentum, end quote, and see worse than expected slowdown. Because several policies on Beijing's agenda, for example stabilizing the housing sector, dealing with local government debt, and a corruption campaign, not to mention navigating the geopolitical environment, all depend on the assumption of stable economic growth this year. If the Caixin writers are correct, the implications of slowdown are significant. And this is very much a contrarian view. Outgoing Premier Li Keqiang proposed a GDP growth target of around 5% this year. The IMF has projected 5.2%, UBS 5.4%, Fitch Ratings, Moody's, Morgan Stanley, Nomura Holdings Inc. all have GDP growth projections of over 5%. This is off a low base from 2022. But this special editorial warns that this may be too optimistic. Let's walk through some of the points they make. While they admit that exports, fixed asset investment and retail sales in the first 2 months of this year all bet expectations, quote, yet despite the encouraging signs, the numbers also indicate the economic recovery has been patchy. A strong rebound in services sectors has contrasted with a more subdued recovery in manufacturing. Consumer spending on restaurants, travel, and other in-person businesses have recorded big jumps, but purchases of big-ticket items, such as cars, have lagged, end quote. They add that high-frequency data for March point to a slowdown in the recovery of real estate sales and coal consumption, which had improved sharply over the previous 2 months, quote, suggesting the pace of month-on-month recovery may start to slide, end quote. They observed too that the economic recovery may not be gaining momentum due to signs that are showing up in the employment data. The surveyed urban unemployment rate stood at 5.6% in February, up 0.1 percentage points from January. Meanwhile, youth unemployment stood at 18.1% in February, up from 15.3% in February 2022, and critically, up from 16.7% at the end of last year, suggesting that the situation has worsened since opening up, though some commentators suggest that this could reflect that more people started looking for jobs after the opening up began. Of course, the wild card for growth this year will be household demand. How long will the concentrated release of demand, suppressed during the pandemic, boost growth? It was assumed at least 2 quarters. Wang Tao, chief China economist at UBS Investment Bank, recently wrote that approximately $87 billion in excess savings built up during the zero-COVID years could be pumped back into the economy this year. But others are not too sure. In a recent report, Haitong Securities analysts argue that it may have cooled down as early as March, writing, quote, that burst of demand may now have passed, and it remains to be seen whether these 2 drivers can continue to lead growth, end quote. The other wild card, which is related to domestic demand, is the property sector. The supply side has been stabilized on life support, but the demand side is still very much in critical condition. In a recent report from Industrial Securities Co. Limited, the chief economist, as well as the chief macro-analyst, wrote that, quote, the long-term transformation of the property market is also weighing on market expectations for the resilience of the economic rebound, end quote. Like I said, if China's growth fails to stabilize at around 5% this year, it will have significant implications, not just for Chinese domestic policies, but also China's geopolitical power projection. It would also make China's deep systemic reform challenges just that much more difficult to manage for regulators and policymakers. We will continue to follow the space generally and household demand in the housing sector specifically in the coming months. Make sure you are subscribed to come along for the ride. And on that point, if you're enjoying today's episode, don't forget to hit that like button. And for anyone who can go the extra mile, as always, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. It's just me making these episodes every day. It's a lot of work, but with your guys' support, I should be able to keep it up every day going forward. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. We've been following the diversification of supply chains over the last few years, driven by a combination of push factors from China, during the zero-COVID days especially, as well as the need to hedge against geopolitical risk. US officials have also warned that the US is too reliant on a small handful of locations for critical chips, a sign from their biggest customer that companies have not missed. One of the industries seeing the most disruption with this process is semiconductor production. In a report published yesterday, Bloomberg writes that Thailand, Vietnam, India and Cambodia have emerged as early winners this year as semiconductor production begins to move away from traditional centers such as Taiwan and the Chinese mainland. Quote, US imports of chips grew 17% from last year to $4.86 billion in February, according to US census data, with Asia accounting for 83% of that total. India saw its semiconductor shipments increase 34 times to $152 million, while Cambodia clocked in an impressive 698% growth, falling just shy of Japan at $166 million, an amount that would be unheard of in years past. End quote. The outlet adds that Vietnam and Thailand, which both have much bigger slices of the chip-making market, increased their US trade in the sector by 75% and 62% respectively. Vietnam has accounted for over 10% of US imports for several straight months. Taiwan still remains a key producer, and with its competitive advantages in the most advanced chips, will likely stay so. Last year, it increased shipments to the US by 4.3%, accounting for 15% of imports. And speaking of Taiwan, this week was Tsai Ing-wen's US stopover in California and former KMT President Ma Ying-jeou's trip to mainland China. Today, Saturday, the People's Liberation Army Eastern Theater Command announced that it has started 3 days of military exercises around Taiwan, describing them as a, quote, serious warning against the Taiwan separatist forces' collusion with external forces, and a necessary move to defend national sovereignty and territorial integrity. End quote. The move, which is named United Sharp Sword, will involve exercises around the north, south and east of Taiwan, according to the PLA announcement. There has been a lot in the news, including on this show, about the previously mentioned trips, Beijing's fiery response to the former, and the implications for the US-China relationship. Now, these are all very important topics to discuss, but there is an aspect that perhaps is overlooked at times. That is, what do the Taiwanese themselves think about all this? Let's end today's video by looking at this question. This week, the US-based think tank, the Brookings Institute, published new survey data of Taiwanese adults in their so-called Taiwan-US Quarterly Analysis series. Let's move through the findings of the report. According to the report, a majority of respondents believe that Pelosi's visit last year was detrimental to Taiwan's security. Quote, at first glance, this seems surprising. However, even as its security environment appears to be deteriorating, a client might not welcome signals of support from their patron, here referring to the US, if the client considers these signals to be so provocative that they undermine its security. End quote. Respondents overwhelmingly believed that the large-scale People's Liberation Army exercises conducted last year after the Pelosi trip created a serious threat to Taiwan. This is in contrast to, quote, media reports in both Taiwan and the West, which suggested that many Taiwanese citizens did not originally seem too bothered by China's reactions, end quote. A large majority agrees, the report writes, that the People's Republic of China's aggressive intentions are a source of instability. A smaller majority believes that increasing levels of support for independence in Taiwan is a source of instability, and only about 55% attribute instability to shifts in US policy toward a One China, One Taiwan policy. Quote, together these results suggest that many voters essentially lean toward the ideas embedded in the traditional US policy of dual deterrence. Taiwan is more secure when the PRC's aggressive intentions are countered and when the PRC is assured that US policy does not encourage formal independence. End quote. The writers of the survey report then provide two tentative implications for policy discussions in Washington about how to preserve Taiwan's security. Quote, first, our data suggests that if a substantial constituency in the client state believes such high-profile signals of support are counterproductive, this can weaken the security relationship between patron and client, making coordinated responses to the common adversary more difficult. A second implication of our results concerns the effectiveness of deterrence. Washington's discourse about how to deter the PRC emphasizes military tools over the synergistic efforts of assuring Beijing that the United States is not encouraging or enabling formal Taiwanese independence. This is a debate over whether dual deterrence is the best of the bad set of options for reducing the probability of conflict. But our analysis of respondents' folk theory of security suggests a considerable portion of the Taiwanese population seems to agree with the dual deterrence notion. End quote. On this theme, one final thing. Singapore-based The Straits Times reports this week that Singapore has seen a surge in ultra-rich Taiwanese looking at opening family offices. When the ultra-rich begin diversifying their wealth away from Taiwan, this should also be seen as a strong sign for concern. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Have a great weekend, everybody. Have a wonderful Easter holiday for those of you in that part of the world. And I will see you all on Monday.